Even those dark ages shall reassert its power and lead men back to their faith in a God of love, not a God of horrors, as those oppressors painted him. From this frozen land I turned away chilled and saddened. I did not care to linger there or explore its secrets, though it may be that again at some future time I may visit it. I felt that there was nothing I could do in that land, none I could understand, and they but froze and revolted me without my doing them any good. On my way back from the frozen land to the land of twilight, I passed a number of vast caverns called the caverns of slumber, wherein lay a great multitude of spirits in a state of complete stupor, unconscious of all around them. These, I learned, were the spirits of mortals who had killed themselves with opium eating and smoking, and whose spirits had thus been deprived of all chance of development and so had retrograded instead of advancing and growing, just as a limb tied up and deprived of motion withers away, and now they were feebler than an unborn infant, and as little able to possess conscious life. In many cases their sleep would last for centuries, in others, where the indulgence in the drug had been less, it might only last for 20, 50, or 100 years. These spirits lived, and that was all, their senses being little more developed than those of some fungus growth which exists without one spark of intelligence. Yet in them the soul germ still lingered, imprisoned like a tiny seed in the wrapping of some Egyptian mummy, which, long as it may lie thus, is yet alive, and will in a kindly soil sprout forth at last. These caverns, in which kind spirit hands had laid them, were full of life-giving magnetism, and a number of attendant spirits who had themselves passed through a similar state, from opium poisoning, in their own earth lives, were engaged in giving what life they could pour into these comatose spirit bodies which lay like rows of dead people all over the floor. By slow degrees, according as the spirit had been more or less injured by the drug taken in the earthly life, these wretched beings would awake to consciousness and all the sufferings experienced by the opium eater when deprived of his deadly drug. By long and slow degrees the poor spirits would awaken, sense by sense, till at last like feeble suffering children they would become fit for instruction, when they would be sent to institutions like your idiot asylums, where the dawning intellect would be trained and helped to develop and those faculties recovered which had been all but destroyed in the earth life. These poor souls would only learn very slowly, because they had to try to learn now, without the aids of the earthly life, those lessons which it had been designed to teach. Like drunkards, only more completely, they had paralysed brain and senses and had avoided, not learned, the lessons of the earthly life and its development of the spirit. To me these caves of slumber were inexpressibly sad to behold, not less so that those wretched slumberers were unconscious for so long of the valuable time they lost in their dreamless, hopeless sleep of stagnation. Like the hare in the fable, while they slept others less swift won the race, and these poor souls might try in vain through countless ages to recover the time which they had lost. When these slumberers shall at last awake, to what a fate do they not waken, through what an awful path must they not climb to reach again that point in the earth life from which they have fallen. 5. Does it not fill our souls with horror to think that there are those on earth who live, and pile up wealth, through the profits made from that dreadful trade in opium, which not alone destroys the body, but would seem to destroy even more fatally the soul, till one would despondently ask if there be indeed hope for these its victims? These awful caves, these terrible stupefied spirits, can any words point a fate more fearful than theirs? To awaken at last with the intellects of idiots, to grow, through hundreds of years, back at last to the possession of the mental powers of children, not of grown men and women. Slow, must be their development even then, for unlike ordinary children they have almost lost the power to grow, and take many generations of time to learn what one generation on earth could have taught them. I have heard it said that many of the unhappy beings, when they have attained at last to the development of infants, are sent back to earth to be reincarnated in an earthly body, that they may enjoy again the advantages they have misused before. But of this I only know by hearsay, and cannot give any opinion of my own upon its truth. I only know that I should be glad to think of any such possibility for them which could shorten the process of development or help them to regain all that they had lost. Chapter X. In my home in the Twilight Land I rested now for a time, studying to learn more of myself and the powers I had within me, and seeking to apply the lessons I had learned in my wanderings. My chief instructor at this time was a man like myself in many respects, who had lived a similar life on earth and had passed through the lower spheres, as I was now doing, and who had become a dweller in a bright land of sunshine from which he came constantly to teach and help those of the brotherhood who, like myself, were his pupils. There was likewise another teacher or guide whom I sometimes saw, whose influence over me was even greater and from whom I learned many strange things, but as he was in a much more advanced sphere than the other, it was but seldom that I could see him as a distinct personality. His teachings came to me more as mental suggestions or inspirational discourses in answer to some questioning thought on my part. This spirit I shall not now describe to you, as at this time of my sojourn in the Twilight Land I saw him but very dimly, and only clearly when my progression had carried me into a brighter state. Though this man was not fully visible to me, I was often conscious of his presence and his aid, and when later on I learned that he had been my principal guardian spirit during my earthly life, I could easily trace many thoughts and suggestions, many of my higher aspirations, to his influence. And it was his voice that had so often spoken to me in warning or in comfort when I struggled on, almost overwhelmed with my terrible position on first entering the spirit world. In the days of darkness I had been faintly conscious of his form flitting in and out of my little cell, and soothing my terrible sufferings with his magnetism and his wonderful knowledge and power. On returning to the Twilight Land from the darker spheres I had visited, I felt almost like returning to a home, for, bare and shabby as my room looked, and small and narrow as it was, it yet held all my greatest treasures, my picture mirror in which I could see my beloved, and the rose, and the letter she had sent to me. Moreover, I had friends there, companions in misfortune like myself, and though we were as a rule much alone, meditating upon our past mistakes and their lessons, yet at times it was very pleasant to have one friend or another come in to see you, and since we were all alike men who had disgraced ourselves by our earthly lives and were now seeking to follow the better way, there was even in that a bond of sympathy. Our life, could I make you fully realize it, would indeed seem strange to you. It was like and yet unlike an earthly life. For instance, we ate at times a simple sort of food provided for us, it would seem, by magic whenever we felt hunger, but often for a week at a time we would not think of food, unless indeed it was one of us who had been fond of good eating on earth, and in that case the desire would be much more frequent and troublesome to satisfy. For myself, my tastes had been somewhat simple, and neither eating nor drinking had in themselves possessed special attractions for me. There was always around us this twilight, which was never varied with dark night or bright day, and which was most especially trying to me in its monotony. I so love light and sunshine. To me it was ever as a life-giving bath. I had been born in a land of earth where all is sunshine and flowers. Then, although we usually walked about this building and the surrounding country much as you do, we could float a little at will, though not so well as more advanced spirits do, and if we were in a great hurry to go anywhere our will seemed to carry us there with the speed almost of thought. As for sleep, we could spend long intervals without feeling its needs, or, again, we could lie and sleep for weeks at a time, sometimes semi-conscious of all that passed, at others in the most complete of slumbers. Another strange thing was our dress, which never seemed to wear out and renewed itself in some mysterious fashion. All through this period of my wanderings and while I was in this abode it was of a very dark blue color, with a yellow girdle round the waist, and an anchor worked in yellow on the left sleeve, with the words "Hope is Eternal" below it. There were close-fitting undergarments of the same dark color. The robe was long and such as you see penitent brotherhoods or monks wear on earth, with a hood hung from the shoulders, which could be used to cover the head and face of any who desired to screen their features from view. And indeed there were often times when we wished to do so, for suffering and remorse had made such changes in us that we were often glad to hide our faces from the gaze of those we loved. The hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, wasted and bent forms, and deep-lined suffering had traced upon each face told their own story but too well, and such of us as had dear friends on earth or in the spirit land still grieving for our loss, sought often at times to hide from their eyes our disfigured forms and faces. Our lives had somewhat of monotony about them in the regular order in which our studies and our lectures followed each other like clockwork. At certain stages, for they did not count time by days or weeks, but only as advance was made in the development of each spirit when a lesson had been learned, in a longer or a shorter time according to the spiritual and intellectual development, the spirit was advanced to a higher branch of the subject studied. Some remain a very long time before they can grasp the meaning of the lesson shown to them. If so, the spirit is in no way hurried or pressed on as is done in earth education, where life seems all too short for learning. As a spirit, a man has all eternity before him and can stand still or go on as he pleases, or he may remain where he is till he has thought out and grasped clearly what has been shown, and then he is ready for the next step, and so on. There is no hurrying anyone faster than he chooses to go, no interference with his liberty to live on in the same state of undevelopment if he wishes, so long as he interferes with the liberty of no one else and conforms to the simple rule which governs that great brotherhood, the rule of freedom and sympathy for all. None were urged to learn, none were kept back from doing so, it was all voluntary, and did anyone seek, as many did, to leave this place, he was free to go where he would, and to return again if he wished. The doors were closed to none, either in going or returning, and none ever sought to reproach another with his faults or shortcomings, for each felt the full depth of his own. Some had been years there, I learned, for to them the lessons were hard and slow to be learned. Others, again, had broken away and gone back to the life of the earth plane so many times that they had descended to the lower sphere at last, and gone through a course of purification in that other house of hope where I had first been. They had appeared to go back instead of forward, yet even this had not been in truth a retrogression but only a needful lesson, since they were thus cured of the desire to try the pleasures of the earth plane again. A few, like myself, who had a strong and powerful motive to rise, made rapid progress and soon passed on from step to step, but there were, alas, too many who required all the hope and all the help that could be given to sustain and comfort them through all their trials, and it was my lot to be able, out of the storehouse of my own hopefulness, to give a share to others less fortunate who were not blessed, as I was, with a stream of love and sympathy flowing ever to me from my beloved on earth, cheering me on to fresh efforts with its promise of joy and peace at last. And now was given to me a fresh source of happiness in being able to spend a certain time on earth with my darling, when she was able to be made fully conscious that I was there. Many times had I been to see her unknown to herself. In all my wanderings I had found time to snatch brief happy moments to go to earth and look at her. And now, although I was still almost invisible to her eyes, yet she could tell that I was present and could feel my touch when I laid my hand on hers. She would place a chair for me beside her own that we might sit side by side again, as in the dear old days that were gone. She would speak to me and could hear faintly what I said in answer, and could even distinguish dimly my form. Ah me! The strangeness, the sadness, and yet the sweetness of those meetings between the living and the dead. I would come to her with my heart full of the bitterest anguish and remorse for the past. The sense of shame and humiliation at what I had become would be such that it seemed hopeless for one such as I was to rise to higher things, and the sight of her sweet face, and the knowledge that she believed in me and loved me in spite of all, would soothe my heart and give me fresh hope, fresh courage to struggle on. From the desolation of our lives, there grew up in those strangely sweet meetings a trust and hope in the future that no words can describe. I learned that she had been developing her powers, and studying how she could use the truly wonderful gifts which she possessed and which had lain dormant for so long, and she was greatly pleased to find how well she was succeeding and how rapidly the curtain which shut me out from her was being drawn aside. And then there came to us another pleasure. My beloved had found a medium through whose peculiar organization it was made possible for a spirit to clothe himself again in the semblance of an earthly body, similar in appearance to his own and recognizable by the friends he had left on earth. I was now enabled to materialize, as it is termed, a solid hand with which to touch her. Great was the happiness this gave to us both, though I was as yet denied the further pleasure of showing myself to Jadir. I was told I could not do so without bearing on the materialist face the traces of my sufferings, and it would only have pained her to see that. Later on, when I was more advanced, I should show myself clearly. Me. How many poor spirit ones would come in crowds to those meetings, hoping for the chance that they too might be able to show themselves and win some recognition, see again someone who was glad to know that they still lived and could return, and how many were always certain to go away sad and disappointed because there were so many and only a certain amount of power, and those who were nearest and dearest were naturally granted a preference. The spirit world is full of lonely souls all eager to return and show that they still live, still think of those whom they have left, still feel an interest in their struggles and are as ready and often more able to advise and help than when they were on earth, were they not shut out by the barriers of the flesh. I have seen so very many spirits hanging about the earth plane when they might have gone to some bright sphere and would not, because of their affection for some beloved ones left to struggle with the trials of earth, and grieving in deepest sorrow for their death. And so the spirits would hang about them, hoping for some chance which would make the mortal conscious of their presence and their constant love. Could these ones but communicate as do friends on earth when one has had to go to a distant country and leave the other behind, there would not be such hopelessness of sorrow as I have often seen. And although years and the ministrations of comforting angels will soften the grief of most mortals, yet would it not be a happier state for both mortals and spirits could they but still hold sweet communion together as of yore? I have known a mother whose son has taken to evil ways, and who believed that mother to be an angel in heaven far away. I have, I say, known her to follow her son for years, striving, and in vain, to impress him with the sense of her presence, that she might warn and save him from his path of sin. I have seen one of a pair of lovers whom some misunderstanding had parted, and between whom death had placed a last insuperable barrier, haunt the beloved one left behind, and seek by all means in his power to convey to her the true state of things, and that their hearts had been ever true whatever might have appeared to the contrary. I have seen spirits in such sorrow, such despair, trying in vain to win one conscious look, one single thought, to show that their presence was felt and understood. I have seen them in their despair cast themselves down before the mortal one and seek to hold her hand, her dress, anything. And the spirit hand was powerless to grasp the mortal one, and the mortal ears were ever deaf to the spirit voice. Only, perhaps, a sense of sorrow would be given, and an intense longing to behold again the dead without power to know that the so-called dead was there beside them. There is no despair of earth, great as it often is, equal to the despair a spirit feels when first he realizes in all its force, the meaning of the barrier which death has placed between him and the world of mortal men. Is it, then, wonderful that on the spirit side of life all means are being taken by those who seek to help and comfort the sorrowing ones, both on the earth and in the spirit land, to roll back these barriers and to open wide the doors that men and angels may walk and talk together upon earth, as in the days of old when the world was but young? If there is much that is trivial, much that seems silly and foolish, and even vulgar or grotesque and terrible, in the manifestations witnessed through many mediums and in many circles, if there are fraudulent mediums and credulous fools or vain and conceited egotists in the movement, is it not so with all great but unrecognized truths struggling for acknowledgement, and should not all these things be excused in view of the fact that they are all attempts, clumsy and foolish it may be, yet still attempts, to open the doors and let the light from the spirit world in upon a sorrowful earth? Find fault with these false or misdirected efforts if you will, but also seek for knowledge to direct them better, and you will help on those who are trying to climb to higher things, and do not try simply to sneer them down and crush and stifle them, rather recognize them for what they are, the efforts of the unseen world to lift the veil that hides your beloved dead from your eyes. Chapter 11. To these meetings for materialization I was always accompanied by that majestic spirit of whom I have already spoken, and whom I now knew by his name of Aranzaman, the Eastern Guide. And as I was now beginning to see him more clearly I will describe him to you. He was a tall, majestic-looking man with long flowing white garments bordered with yellow, and a yellow girdle around his waist. His complexion was that of an Eastern, of a pale dusky tint. The features were straight and beautifully molded, as one sees them in the statues of Apollo, though their peculiar Eastern cast caused them to vary a little from the perfect Grecian type. His eyes were large, dark, soft, and tender as a woman's, yet with a latent fire and force of passion in their depths which, though subdued and controlled by his strong will, yet gave a warmth and intensity to his looks and manner, from which I could easily believe that in his earth life he had known all the sweetness, and all the passion of violent love and hate. Now his passions were purified from all earthly dross, and served but as links of sympathy between him and those who, like myself, were still struggling to subdue their lower natures, and conquer their passions. A short silky black beard covered his cheeks and chin, and his soft wavy black hair hung somewhat long upon his shoulders. His figure, though tall and powerful, had all the litheness and supple grace of his Eastern race, for so marked are the types of each race that even the spirit bears still the impress of its earthly nationality, and although centuries had passed since Aurangzeb had left the earthly body he retained all the peculiarities which distinguish the Eastern from the Western people. The spirit was strangely like an earthly mortal man, and yet so unlike in that peculiar dazzling brightness of form and feature which no words can ever paint, nor pen describe, that strange and wonderful ethereality, and yet distinct tangibility, which only those who have seen a spirit of the higher spheres can truly understand. In his earth life he had been a deep student of the occult sciences, and since his entry into the spirit world he had expanded and increased his knowledge till to me it seemed there was no limit to his powers. Like myself, of a warm and passionate nature, he had learned during long years of spirit life to overcome and subdue all his passions, till now he stood upon a pinnacle of power whence he stooped down ever to draw up strugglers like myself, whom his sympathy and ready understanding of our weaknesses made ready to receive his help, while one who had never himself fallen would have spoken to us in vain. With all his gentleness and ready sympathy, however, he had also a power of will against which, when he chose to exert it, one sought in vain to fight, and I have beheld, on more than one occasion, some of the wild passionate beings amongst whom he worked, brought to a stop in something they were about to do which would have harmed themselves or others. They would be spellbound and unable to move a limb, yet he had never touched them. It was but by his own powerful will, which was so much stronger than theirs, that for the time they were paralyzed. Then he would argue the matter with them, kindly and frankly, and show to them in some of his wonderful ways the full consequences to themselves and others of what they were about to do, and when he had done so, would lift from them the spell of his will and leave them free to act as they desired, free to commit the meditated sin now that they knew its consequences. And seldom have I known any who, after so solemn a warning, would still persist in following their own path. I myself have always been considered one whose will was strong, and who could not readily give it up to any others, but beside this spirit I have felt myself a child and have bowed more than once to the force of his decisions. And here let me say that in all things in the spirit world man is free as air to follow his own inclinations and desires if he wishes, and does not choose to take the advice offered to him. The limitations to a man's own indulgence and the extent to which he can infringe upon the rights of others, are regulated by the amount of law and order existing in the sphere to which he belongs. For example, in the lowest sphere of all, where no law prevails but the law of the strongest oppressor, you may do what you please, you may injure or oppress another to the very last limits of his endurance, and those who are stronger than you will do the same to you. The most oppressed slaves on earth are less unhappy than those whom I have seen in the lowest sphere of all, where no law prevails and where only those spirits are to be found who have defied all laws of God or man and have been a law to themselves, exercising the most boundless oppression and wrong towards their neighbors. In those spheres which I shall shortly describe, it seems that strong and cruel and oppressive as a spirit may be there is always found someone still stronger to oppress him, someone still crueler, still wickeder, still more oppressive, till at last you arrive at those who may truly be said to reign in hell, kings and emperors of evil. And it goes on till at last the very excess of evil will work its own cure, the worst and most tyrannical will long for some other state of things, some laws to restrain, some power to control. And that feeling will be the first step, the first desire for a better life, which will give the brothers of hope sent to work in those dark spheres, the little loophole through which to give the idea of improvement, and the hope that it is still possible for them. As the spirit progresses upwards, there will be found in each circle of the ladder of progress an increased degree of law and order prevailing, to which he will be ready to conform himself, as he expects others to conform where the laws affect him. The perfect observance of the highest moral laws is found only in the highest spheres, but there are many degrees of observance, and he who respects the rights of others will find his rights respected, while he who tramples upon his neighbor will in his turn be trampled upon by the stronger ones. In all respects man in the spirit world is free, to work or to be idle, to do good or to do evil, to win a blessing or a curse. Such as he is, such will be his surroundings, and the sphere for which he is fitted must ever be the highest to which he can attain till his own efforts fit him to become a dweller in one higher. Thus the good need no protection against the evil in the spirit world. Their own different states place an insurmountable barrier between them. Those above can always descend at will to visit or help those below them, but between them and the lower spirits there is a great gulf fixed which the lower ones cannot pass. Only upon your earth and on other planets where material life exists, can there be the mixture of good and evil influences with almost equal power. I say almost equal, since even on earth the good have the greater power, unless man shuts himself out from their aid by the indulgence of his lower passions. In days of old, when men's hearts were simple as little children's, the spirit world lay close at their doors and they knew it not, but now men have drifted far from it, and are like mariners upon a raft, who are seeking now again through fog and mist to find it. Kind pilots of the spirit world are striving to guide and help them to reach that radiant land, that they may bring back a bright store of hope and light for the weary strugglers upon earth. Chapter 12. The meetings for materialization were held once a fortnight, and from the number of them I judged that about 3 months had passed, when I was told by Aranzaman to prepare myself for a great change which was about to take place in myself and my surroundings, and which would mean my passing into a higher sphere. I have heard the spheres divided differently by different spirit teachers, and it is not very important that they should be all divided by the same standard, since these divisions are very similar to mapping out a country where the boundaries melt so imperceptibly into one another that it is not very essential to have the limits defined with perfect exactitude, since the changes in the countries and the people will of themselves mark their different states as you progress on your journey. Thus, then, some will tell you there are 7 spheres and that the 7th means the heavens spoken of in the Bible, others say there are 12 spheres, others again extend the number. Each sphere is, however, divided into circles, usually 12 to a sphere, though here again some spirits will reckon them differently, just as your standards of measurement on earth differ in different countries, yet the thing they measure remains the same. For myself, I have been used to count that there are 7 spheres above the earth and 7 below it, using the terms above and below as signifying the nearness to, or distance from, the great central sun of our solar system, the nearest point of attraction towards that sun being considered to be our highest point of attainment, while in the limits of the earth spheres, and the farthest away being regarded as our lowest or most degraded sphere. Each sphere, then, being subdivided into 12 circles which are blended so closely into each other that you appear to pass almost insensibly from one to the other. I had hitherto been in what is called the earth plane, which like a great broad belt circles around the earth and permeates its atmosphere. This earth plane may be said to comprehend within its bounds the first of the 7 spheres above and the first of those below the earth, and is used commonly in describing the habitations of those spirits who are said to be earthbound in a greater or less degree because they are not able to sink below the earth attractions nor to free themselves from its influences. I was now told that I had so far freed myself from the earth's attractions and overcome my desires for earthly things, that I was able to pass into the 2nd sphere. The passing from the body of a lower sphere into that of a higher one is often, though not invariably, accomplished during a deep sleep which closely resembles the death sleep of the spirit in leaving the earthly body. As a spirit grows more elevated, more etherealized, this change is accompanied by a greater degree of consciousness, till at last the passing from one high sphere to another is simply like changing one garb for another a little finer, discarding one spiritual envelope for a more ethereal one. Thus the soul passes onward, growing less and less earthly, or material, in its envelopment, till it passes beyond the limits of our earth spheres into those of the solar systems. It happened, then, that upon my return from one of my visits to the earth, I felt overpowered by a strange unusual sense of drowsiness, which was more like paralysis of the brain than sleep. I retired to my little room in the twilight land, and throwing myself upon my couch, sank at once into a profound dreamless slumber like unto the unconscious sleep of death. In this state of unconsciousness I lay for about 2 weeks of earthly time, and during it my soul passed from the disfigured astral body and came forth like a newborn child, clothed in the brighter, purer spiritual envelope, which my efforts at overcoming the evil in myself had created for it. Only I was not born as an infant but as a full-grown man, even as my experience and knowledge had been those of a mature spirit. There are some mortals whose knowledge of life is so limited, whose minds have been so little cultivated, and whose natures are so simple and childlike, that they are born into the spirit world as mere children, however many years of earth life they may have known, but it was not so with me, and in assuming my new condition I also possessed the development in age which my earth life had given me. In a state of perfect unconsciousness my newborn soul was borne by the attendant spirit friends into the second sphere, where I lay sleeping my dreamless sleep till the time came for my awakening. The discarded astral envelope I had left was by the power of attendant spirits dissolved into the elements of the earth plane, even as my earthly body left at my first death would decay into the earthly material from which it had been taken, dust returning into dust again, while the immortal soul passed on to a higher state. Thus did I pass through my second death and awake to the resurrection of my higher self. End of Part I. Part 2. The Dawn of Light. Part 2. The Dawn of Light. Chapter 13. On my awakening for the second time from a sleep of death to consciousness in the spirit world, I found that I was in much pleasanter surroundings. There was daylight at last, though it was as that of a dull day without sun, yet what a blessed change from the dismal twilight and the dark night. I was in a neat little room quite like an earthly one, lying upon a little bed copyright F soft white down. Before me was a long window looking out upon a wide stretch of hills and undulating country. There were no trees, or shrubs, to be seen, and hardly any flowers, save here and there some little simple ones like flowering weeds, yet even these were refreshing to the eyes, and there were ferns and grass clothing the ground with a carpet of verdure instead of the hard bare soil of the twilight land. This region was called the Land of Dawn, and truly the light was as the day appears before the sun has arisen to warm it. The sky was of a pale blue-gray, and white cloudlets seemed to chase each other across it and float in quiet masses on the horizon. You who think that there are no clouds and no sunshine in the spirit lands hardly know how beautiful a thing you would shut out, unless you have spent, as I did, a long monotonous time without seeing either of them. The room I was in, though by no means luxurious, was yet fairly comfortable in appearance, and reminded me of some cottage interior upon earth. It held all that was needful to comfort, if nothing that was specially beautiful, and it had not that bare prison-like look of my former dwellings. There were a few pictures of scenes of my earth life which had been pleasant, and the recollections they called up gave me a fresh pleasure. There were also some pictures of spirit life, and oh joy! There was my picture mirror, and my rose, and the letter all my treasures. I stopped my explorations to look into that mirror and see what my beloved was doing. She was asleep, and on her face was a happy smile as if even in her dreams she knew some good had befallen me. Then I went to the window and looked out over the country and those long rolling hills, treeless and somewhat bare, save for their covering of grass and ferns. I looked long upon this scene, it was so like and yet so unlike earth, so strangely bare and yet so peaceful. My eyes, long wearied with those lower spheres, rested in joy and peace upon this new scene, and the thought that I had thus risen to a new life filled me with a thankfulness of heart unspeakable. At last I turned from the window, and seeing what was like a small mirror near me, I looked to see what change there might be in myself. I started back with an exclamation of joy and surprise. Was it possible? Could this be as I appeared now? I gazed and gazed again. This myself? Why, I was young again. I looked a man of about 30 or 35, not more certainly, and I beheld myself as I had been in my prime on earth. I had looked so old, so haggard, so miserable in that twilight land that I had avoided to look at myself. I had looked 20 times worse than I could ever have looked on earth, had I lived to be 100 years old. And now, why, I was young. I held out my hand, it was firm and fresh looking like my face. A closer inspection of myself pleased me still more. I was in all respects a young man again in my prime of vigor, yet not quite as I had been, no. There was a sadness in my look, a certain something more in the eyes than anywhere else that showed the suffering through which I had passed. I knew that never again could I feel the heedless buoyant ecstasy of youth, for never again could I go back and be quite as I had been. The bitter past of my life rose up before me and checked my buoyant thoughts. The remorse for my past sins was with me yet, and cast still its shadow over even the joy of this awakening. Never, never can we undo all the past life of earth, so that no trace of it will cling to the risen spirit, and I have heard that even those who have progressed far beyond what I have even yet done, bear still the scars of their past sins and sorrows, scars that will slowly, very slowly, wear away at last in the great ages of eternity. For me there had come joy, great joy, wonderful fulfillment of my hope, yet there clung to me the shadow of the past, and its dark mantle clouded even the happiness of this hour. While I yet mused upon the change which had passed over me, the door opened and a spirit glided in, dressed, as I now was, in a long robe of a dark blue color with yellow borderings, and the symbol of our order on the sleeve. He had come to invite me to a banquet which was to be given to myself and others who were newly arrived from the lower sphere. All is simple here, said he, even our festivals, yet there will be the salt of friendship to season it and the wine of love to refresh you all. Today you are our honored guests, and we all wait to welcome you as those who have fought a good fight and gained a worthy victory. Then he took me by the hand and led me into a long hall, with many windows looking out upon more hills and a great peaceful quiet lake. Here there were long tables spread for the banquet, and seats placed round for us all. There were about 500 or 600 brothers newly arrived, like myself, and about 1,000 more who had been there for some time and who were going about from one to another introducing themselves and welcoming the newcomers cordially. Here and there someone would recognize an old friend or comrade, or one who had either assisted them or been assisted by them in the lower spheres. They were all awaiting the arrival of the presiding spirit of the order in this sphere, who was called the Grand Master. Presently the large doors at one end of the hall were seen to glide apart of themselves, and a procession entered. First came a most majestic handsome spirit in robes of that rich deep blue color one sees in the pictures of the Virgin Mary. These robes were lined with white and bordered with yellow, while a hood of yellow lined with white hung from the shoulders, and on the sleeve was embroidered the symbol of the Order of Hope. Behind this man were about 100 or so of youths, all in white and blue robes, who bore in their hands wreaths of laurel. At the upper end of the hall there was a handsome chair of state, with a white, blue, and yellow canopy over it, and after saluting us all the Grand Master seated himself in it, while the youths ranged themselves in a semicircle behind him. After a short prayer of thanksgiving to Almighty God for us all, he addressed us in these terms: My brethren, you who are assembled to welcome these wanderers who are to find, for a time, rest and peace, sympathy and love, in this our house of hope, and you are wandering brothers, whom we are all assembled to welcome and to honor as conquerors in the great battle against selfishness and sin, to you we give our heartiest greeting, and bid you accept, as members of our great brotherhood, these tributes of our respect and honor, which we offer and which you have fairly won. And from the increased happiness of your own lives we bid you stretch forth your hands in brotherly love to all the sorrowing ones whom you have left still toiling in the darkness of the earth life and in the spheres of the earth plane, and as you shall yourselves know yet more perfect triumphs, yet nobler conquests, so seek yet to give to others yet more and more of the perfect love of our great brotherhood, whose highest and most glorious masters are in the heavens, and whose humblest members are yet struggling sinners in the dark earth plane. In one long and unbroken chain our great order shall stretch from the heavens to the earth, while this planet shall support material life, and each and every one of you must ever remember that you are links of that great chain, fellow workers with the angels, brother workers with the most oppressed. I summon you now, each in your turn, to receive and to cherish as a symbol of the honor you have won, these wreaths of fadeless laurel which shall crown the victor's brows. In the name of the great supreme ruler of the universe, in the name of all angels and of our brotherhood, I crown each one and dedicate you to the cause of light and hope and truth. Then at a signal we, the new arrivals, many of us almost overcome by these kindly words and this mark of honor, drew near, and, kneeling down before the Grand Master, had placed upon our heads these laurel crowns which the youths handed to the Master, and with which he crowned us with his own hands. When the last one had received his crown, such a shout of joy went up from the assembled brothers, such cheers, and then they sang a most beautiful song of praise, with so lovely a melody and such poetical words that I would I could reproduce it all for you. When this was over we were each led to a seat by an attendant brother and the banquet began. You will wonder how such a banquet could be in the spirit world, but do you think that even on earth your all of enjoyment at such a scene is in the food you eat, the wine you drink, and do you imagine that a spirit has no need for food of any kind? If so, you are in error. We need, and we eat, food, though not of so material a substance as is yours. There is no animal food of any sort, nor anything like it, save only in the lowest spheres of earth-bound spirits, where they enjoy through others yet in the flesh the satisfaction of the animal appetites. But there are in this second sphere the most delicious fruits, almost transparent to look at, which melt in your mouth as you eat them. There is wine like sparkling nectar, which does not intoxicate or create a thirst for more. There are none of those things which would gratify coarse appetites, but there are delicate cakes and a sort of light bread. Of such fare and such wine did this banquet consist, and I for one confess I never enjoyed anything more than the lovely fruits which were the first I had seen in the spirit world, and which I was told were truly the fruits of our own labors grown in the spirit land by our efforts to help others. After the banquet was over there was another speech, and a grand chorus of thanks, in which we all joined. Then we dispersed, some of us to see our friends upon earth and try to make them feel that some happy event had befallen us. Many of us, alas, were being mourned as among the lost souls who had died in sin, and it was a great grief to us that these earthly friends could not be made conscious how great were now our hopes. Others of the brothers turned to converse with newly found spirit friends, while for my part I went straight to earth to tell the good news to my beloved. I found her about to attend one of those meetings for materialization and, trembling with joy and eagerness, I followed her there, for now I knew there was no longer any reason why I should not show my face to her who had been so faithful and so patient in waiting for me. No longer would the sight of me give pain or shock her. Ah, what a happy night that was! I stood beside her all the time. I touched her again and again. I stood there, no more the dark shrouded figure hiding his face from all eyes. No. I was there in my new dress with my new hopes, my risen body, and the ashes of my dead past were there no more to give me such shame and sorrow of heart as I had known. And then oh! crowning joy to that most joyful day, I showed myself to her wondering eyes, and they gazed into my own. But she did not know me at once, she was looking for me as she had seen me last on earth, with face of care and wrinkled brow, and the young man's face looked strange to her. Yet not quite strange, she smiled and looked with a puzzled wondering look which, could I but have held the material particles of my form together for but a few more moments, must have changed to recognition. But, alas! all too soon I felt my material form melting from me like soft wax, and I had to turn and go as it faded away. But as I went I heard her say, it was so like, so very like what my dear friend must have been in youth. It was so like and yet so unlike him, I hardly know what to think. Then I went behind her and whispered in her ear that it was I myself, and no other. And she heard my whisper and laughed and smiled, and said she had felt sure it must be so. Then indeed the cup of my joy was full, then indeed was the crown of my day complete. Chapter 14. After this there came for me a time of happiness, a season of rest and refreshment upon which I shall not dwell. Its memories are all too sacred to me, for those days were spent near to her I loved, and I had the happiness of knowing that she was conscious of much, though not all, I said to her, and I spent so much of my time on earth that I had none to explore the wonders of that land of dawn of which I had become an inhabitant. And now a fresh surprise awaited me. In all my wanderings since my death I had never once seen any of my relatives nor the friends who had passed before me into the spirit land. But one day when I came as usual to see my beloved, I found her full of some mysterious message she had received, and which she was to give me herself. After a little she told me that it was from a spirit who had come to visit her, and who said he was my father and that he wished her to give his message to me. I was so overcome when she said this that I could scarce speak, scarce ask what his message was. I had so loved my father upon earth, for my mother had died when I was so young that she was but a faint tender memory to me. But my father, he had been everything to me. He had had such pride and joy in all my successes, such hopes for my future. And, then, when I had made shipwreck of my life, I knew that I had broken his heart. He did not long survive the crushing of all his hopes, and since his death I had only thought of him with pain and shame of heart. And now when I heard that from beyond the gates of death he had come to my beloved and spoken to her of me, I feared lest his words might be but a lament over his buried hopes, his degraded son, and I cried out that I could not dare to meet him, yet I longed to hear what he had said, and to know if there J's was in it a word of forgiveness for me, his son, who had so deeply sinned. How shall I tell what his words had been? How say what I felt to hear them? They fell upon my heart as dew upon a thirsty land, those words of his, and are far, far too precious to be given to the world, but surely the father in the parable must have welcomed back his prodigal son in some such words as these. Ah! How I cried out to my beloved when I heard those words, and how I longed to see that father again and be taken once more to his heart as when I was a boy. And as I turned away I beheld his spirit standing by us, just as I had seen him last in life, only with the glory of the spirit world upon him such as no mortal eyes have ever seen. My father so long parted from me, and to meet again thus. We had no words to greet each other with but my father and my son, but we clasped each other to the heart in a joy that required no words. When our feelings had calmed down again we began to speak of many things, and not least of her whose love had led me so far upon my upward path, and then I learned that this beloved father had helped, watched over, and protected us both, that he had followed me during all my wanderings both on earth and in the spirit land, and had protected and comforted me in my struggles. Unseen himself he had yet been near, and unceasing in his efforts and his love. All this time when I had so shrunk from the thought of meeting him he had been there, only waiting an opportunity to make himself known, and he had come at last through her who had so much of my love, in order that he might thereby link us all three more closely together in the joy of this reunion. Chapter 15. When I returned to the spirit land, my father went with me and we spent a long time together. In the course of our conversation he told me that an expedition was about to be sent from this sphere to work as rescuers in the lowest sphere of all, a sphere below any I had yet seen and which was in truth the hell believed in by the church. How long the expedition would be absent was not known, but a certain work had to be accomplished, and like an invading army we would remain till we had attained our object. My Eastern guide advised me to join this band of workers, and as my father had in earth life sent his sons forth to fight for their beloved country, so did he now wish me to go forth with this army of soldiers in the cause of truth and light and hope. To fight successfully against these powers of evil, it was necessary to be beyond the temptations of the earth plane and lower spheres, and to help the unhappy ones by a visible help which they could see and take hold of. One must not belong to the higher spheres, for spirits more advanced than the brothers of hope in this, the first circle of the second sphere, would be quite invisible to the unhappy ones who could neither see nor hear them. Also in entering these lowest spheres we would, in order to be visible, have to clothe ourselves in a certain portion of their material elements, and this a more advanced spirit could not do. So that although unseen helpers from the higher spheres would accompany the expedition to protect and assist us, they would be invisible alike to ourselves and those whom we had come to help. Those who were to go upon this expedition with me were similar to myself in disposition, and it was felt that we would all learn much from seeing to what our passionate feelings would have sunk us, had we indulged in them. At the same time we would be able to rescue from those dark spheres many poor repentant souls. Those whom we rescued would be taken to where I had been on my first passing over from earth life, where there were numerous institutions specially set apart for such poor spirits, presided over and attended by spirits who had themselves been rescued from the kingdoms of hell and who were therefore best fitted to aid these poor wanderers. Besides the Brothers of Hope from the Land of Dawn, there were other similar bands from other brotherhoods always being sent down to the dark spheres, such expeditions being, in fact, part of the great system of help for sinners ever being carried on in the name of the eternal Father of all, who dooms none of his children to an eternity of misery. A number of friends would accompany us a part of our journey, and our expedition would be commanded by a leader who had himself been rescued from the dark spheres and who knew their especial dangers. As we would pass through the earth plane and lower spheres we would see them in a way we had not done before, and my Eastern guide said he would send one of his pupils to accompany me as far as the lowest sphere, in order that he might explain to me and make visible some of the mysteries of the astral plane which we would see as we passed. Hassan, as the student was named, was studying those mysteries of nature which have been classed under the name of magic and as such deemed evil, whereas it is their abuse only which is evil. A more extended intelligent knowledge of them would tend to prevent many existing evils and counteract some of those evil powers brought to bear upon man, often very injuriously, in his present helpless ignorance. This student spirit had been a Persian and a follower of Zoroaster in his earth life, as Aurangzeb himself had been, and they belonged still to that school of thought of which Zoroaster was the great exponent. In the spirit world, said Aurangzeb, there are an infinite number of different schools of thought, all containing the great fundamental eternal truths of nature, but each differing in many minor details, and also as to how these great truths should be applied for the advancement of the soul. They likewise differ as to how their respective theories will work out, and the conclusions to be drawn from the undoubted knowledge they possess, when it is applied to subjects upon which they have no certain knowledge and which are still with them as with those on earth, the subject of speculation, theory, and discussion. It is a mistake to suppose that in the spirit world of our planet there is any absolute knowledge which can explain all the great mysteries of creation, the why and wherefore of our being, the existence of so much evil mixed with the good, or the nature of the soul and how it comes from God. The waves of truth are continually flowing from the great thought centers of the universe, and are transmitted to earth through chains of spirit intelligences, but each spirit can only transmit such portions of truth as his development has enabled him to understand, and each mortal can only receive as much knowledge as his intellectual faculties are able to assimilate and comprehend. Neither spirits nor mortals can know everything, and spirits can only give you what are the teachings which their own particular schools of thought and advanced teachers give as their explanations. Beyond this they cannot go, for beyond this they do not themselves know. There is no more absolute certainty in the spirit world than on earth, and those who assert that they have the true and only explanation of these great mysteries are giving you merely what they have been taught by more advanced spirits, who, with all due deference to them, are no more entitled to speak absolutely than the most advanced teachers of some other school. I assert with knowledge not my own, but from another who is indeed regarded in the spirit world as a leader of most advanced thought, that it is in no way possible to give a final answer to or explanation of subjects which are beyond the powers of any spirit of our entire solar system to solve, and still more beyond those of the spirits of our earth spheres. In these subjects and their explanation are involved and required a knowledge of the limits of the universe itself which has no limits, and of the nature of that supreme being of whom no man or spirit can know the nature, save in so far as we can grasp the great truth that he is infinite spirit, limitless in all senses, unknowable and unknown. Let men and spirits, then, argue or explain, they can only teach you to the limits of their own knowledge, and beyond that again are limits none can reach. How can any pretend to show you the ultimate end of that which has no end, or sound the great depths of an infinite thought which has no bottom? Thought is as eternal as life and as fathomless. Spirit is infinite and all-pervading. God is in all and over and above all, yet none know his nature nor what manner of essence he is of, save that he is in everything and everywhere. The mind of man must pause on the very threshold of his inquiries, appalled by the sense of his own littleness, and the most he can do is to learn humbly and study cautiously, that each step be assured before he essays again to climb. The most lofty, the most daring minds cannot grasp all at once, and can man on earth hope that all can be explained to him with his limited range of vision, when the most advanced minds in the spirit world are ever being checked in their explorations after truth by the sense of their limited powers. Chapter 16. The friend whom Aurangzeb sent to accompany and instruct me, appeared to my eyes as a youth of about 25 to 30 years of age, judging by earth's standard in such matters, but he told me he had lived to upwards of 60 years on earth. His present appearance was that of his spiritual development, which alone constitutes the age of a spirit. As a spirit grows more highly developed in his intellectual powers, the appearance becomes more matured, till at last he assumes that of a sage, without, however, the wrinkles and defects of age in earth life, only its dignity, its power, and its experience. Thus, when a spirit had attained to the highest possible development of the earth, or any